The cameras adored him. The models revered him. The public hailed him as a god. But when the lights went out, Yves Saint Laurent was left alone, staring into a mirror that reflected back a broken image. Who was this man, truly? A visionary who liberated women, or a prisoner of his own demons? Paris crowned him as Dior's heir, the genius destined to define an era. At barely 21, he turned fashion into a language of revolution. He created Le Smoking, a tuxedo for women that was not just a garment, but a manifesto. Every seam, every button, every shadow of silk challenged centuries of patriarchal tradition. It was rebellion, dressed as elegance. But while the world saw in him an icon, inside him burned a silent fire. Depression, addictions, deep fears. Saint Laurent lived between two realities, the runway that lifted him to the heavens, and the dark nights that dragged him into hell. His life was a constant pendulum between sublime creation and brutal self-destruction. They called him master, liberator, myth. He himself felt like a castaway, lost in a sea of excess and melancholy. Fashion was both his temple and his prison. Success, both his glory and his curse. This is the story of Yves Saint Laurent, a man who dressed the world in freedom, and who never managed to strip his own soul of the chains that consumed him. Oran, French, Algeria, 1936. The Mediterranean sun fell like a white flame upon the dusty streets, and in the midst of that scorching landscape, a restless-eyed boy was born, Yves-Henri Donat Mathieu Saint Laurent. It was a world of contrasts, the endless blue sea facing a city marked by colonial tensions, bourgeois luxury, and silences heavy with secrets. His family belonged to the privileged class. His father, a respected businessman. His mother, an elegant woman who seemed to move as though she were always walking down an invisible runway. Inside that home, young Yves discovered that beauty could be a refuge. While other children played in the streets, he cut paper figurines, sketched impossible dresses, and built a private universe where art felt more real than reality itself. But growing up in Oran was not simple. From a very young age, Yves felt different, too sensitive, too fragile in a world that demanded hardness. School became a battlefield. Insults, mockery, the cruel gazes of classmates who could not understand his delicacy. That early wound, the wound of a child who did not fit, would mark him forever. Every design that years later would conquer Paris carried within it that desperate desire to belong, and at the same time, to escape. His mother, Lucienne, was his first muse. He would watch her dress before the mirror, perfume floating in the air, fabrics dancing under the light. She not only protected him, she also gave him permission to dream. She fed his imagination, encouraging him to pursue that sensitivity others dismissed as weakness. From her, Yves learned that in femininity there was a secret power, a force capable of transforming the world. At 17, his destiny began to take shape. He entered an international design contest organized by the Wool Secretariat in Paris. He sent sketches drawn with the precision of an obsessive artist and, against all odds, won third place. To the world it was a small triumph, but to him, it was a revelation, the confirmation that his fantasies could become reality. A year later, he returned and won again. This time, first place. Among the judges was Christian Dior, who, upon seeing his designs, was fascinated. In that instant, like a scene written by fate, Yves's life changed forever. From a timid teenager in Algeria, he became the protege of one of the gods of Haute Couture in Paris. But behind that meteoric rise, there still lived a boy carrying his fears. Yves never ceased to be that wounded youth, fragile, with a heart made of glass. His childhood in Oran marked by difference, by incomprehension, by the need to hide in art would become both the engine of his genius and the root of his torments. When Yves left Algeria for Paris, he left behind not only the Mediterranean heat, but the child he had been. though he could never truly escape him. Paris awaited with open arms, but also with the brutal pressure of an industry that forgave no weakness. And that contrast between the fragile boy and the rising genius would become the central drama of his entire life. Paris, 1955. The city was a perfect stage. Smoke-filled cafes, avenues glowing under yellow lights, and Haute Couture reigning like a religion. At the altar stood its high priest, Christian Dior, the man who had restored France's hope after the war with his famous new look. Into that temple arrived a young Yves Saint Laurent, just 19, timid, clutching his sketches to his chest as if they were talismans. Dior welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and astonishment. Before him was not an ordinary apprentice, but a boy who drew dresses like poems. His strokes were not technical, but emotional, as if each line carried a secret wound. Dior, whose intuition rarely failed him, recognized immediately that this young man had a gift. "He will be my successor," he confided to his team. No one believed it then, but those words would soon become prophecy. For the next 2 years, Yves lived in a whirlwind of learning. In the salons of Avenue Montaigne, he absorbed every detail: the fall of a fabric, the reverent silence of clients as they tried on a gown, the tension backstage before each show. Dior treated him with paternal tenderness, as if in that fragile youth he saw a reflection of his own vulnerability. For Yves, Dior was more than a mentor. He was the father figure he had always needed. But in 1957, fate revealed its cruel face. Christian Dior died suddenly of a heart attack while on vacation in Italy. He was only 52. The fashion world was left in shock. The press mourned the fallen genius. Clients feared the end of the house, and employees wondered who could hold the empire together. The answer came with brutal swiftness. The young Yves Saint Laurent, at only 21, was named artistic director. The decision seemed madness. How could someone so fragile, almost still a boy, carry the weight of the most powerful maison in the world? But the industry soon discovered he was a prodigy. His first collection, presented in January 1958, was an absolute triumph. Critics hailed it as the trapeze line. Light dresses with wide cuts that freed the female body from decades of rigidity. Paris roared its approval. The timid boy from Oran had conquered the capital of fashion. That moment should have marked the beginning of endless glory. But for Yves, it was also the beginning of an abyss. The pressure was unbearable. Newspapers called him the Crown Prince. Clients demanded miracles, and each season he was expected to surpass Dior himself. Yves, who had always been fragile, began to feel the weight like a curse. At night, while the city celebrated his name, he locked himself in his apartment, consumed by anxiety. He turned to tranquilizers to sleep, to alcohol to endure the pressure. Barely in his 20s, he was already aging under the weight of the myth. The final blow came with the Algerian War. In 1960, Yves was drafted into military service. The experience was devastating. Humiliated, harassed for his sexuality, torn from his world. He fell into a deep depression. He was committed to a psychiatric hospital where he was subjected to brutal treatments. Meanwhile, in Paris, the House of Dior replaced him without hesitation. The betrayal cut like a knife. The child prodigy who had saved Dior after the death of its founder was now discarded like a broken piece. When he emerged from the hospital thin, trembling, his mind scarred by invisible wounds, Yves was no longer the same. He had touched the highest success and fallen into the darkest hell. But in that abyss, he found a certainty. If the world wanted to destroy him, he would build his own kingdom. With the support of Pierre Berger, his partner and inseparable ally, Yves founded his own house in 1961. Yves Saint Laurent, Haute Couture. The young exile from Dior was about to write history under his own name, a history of glory, rebellion, and self-destruction that had only just begun. Paris breathed the air of change. As the streets boiled with student protests and a new youth challenged the old rules, a man marked by fragility and rebellion raised his own banner in the world of fashion, Yves Saint Laurent. With the unwavering support of Pierre Bergé, his partner in love and in business, he founded the maison that would bear his own name. It was an act of defiance, almost a revenge against the industry that had discarded him after his fall at Dior. At only 25, Yves did not merely want to design clothes. He wanted to rewrite the very language of elegance. His first collection under the YSL label was a declaration of war. Minimalist dresses, clean lines, a style that openly defied the classical rigidity of haute couture. He was not seeking to please, he wanted to provoke. And he succeeded. The audience split in two. Some accused him of heresy, of destroying tradition. Others hailed him as a revolutionary. Yves smiled shyly, but inside he knew he had lit a fire that no one would be able to extinguish. The true earthquake came in 1966 with the opening of Rive Gauche, the first luxury Pret-a-Porter boutique. Until that moment, haute couture was a closed world, reserved for millionaires and aristocrats. Yves shattered the barrier. He brought elite fashion to the streets, to students, to young women who longed to dress boldly without belonging to the aristocracy. The concept was both scandal and triumph, marking the birth of the democratization of luxury. That same year, he unveiled his most legendary creation, Le Smoking, a tuxedo for women. Simple in appearance, devastating in impact. It was not just a garment, it was a manifesto. Women did not need to imitate men to wield power. They could claim their clothing and transform it into a symbol of seduction and authority. Conservative society was outraged. Restaurants in New York and Paris refused entry to women in trousers. Yet YSL's clients entered anyway, wrapped in a new armor of confidence. His muse multiplied. Catherine Deneuve, Lulu de la Falaise, Betty Catrou. Enigmatic, nocturnal women who embodied the Saint Laurent aesthetic, slender, androgynous, radiating a cold, defiant sensuality. With them, Yves was not merely building collections. He was constructing an entire universe. A Paris no longer of lace and corsets, but of leather, velvet, and cigarette smoke curling through private clubs. The House of YSL became synonymous with modernity. Every show was a spectacle where the classical collided with the daring. Tunics inspired by Morocco, safari jackets, dresses with Mondrian's blocks of color, scandalous transparencies that screamed of sexual freedom. Yves was not simply designing clothes, he was designing attitudes, designing futures. But the empire he built carried a double edge. Every success amplified the pressure. Every round of applause drew him closer to the summit and closer to the void. Yves was an obsessive perfectionist. He examined every seam, every fabric, every fitting as though his life depended on it. And in a way, it did. Without fashion, without applause, Yves did not know how to exist. Meanwhile, Pierre Bergé managed the machinery of the business. He was Yves' fortress, but also the stern guardian who pushed him forward when fragility threatened to paralyze him. Between them, there was love, complicity, and epic battles. They were partners and lovers, allies and adversaries, bound by a tie that neither excess nor time could break. In just one decade, Yves Saint Laurent rose from the boy rejected by Dior to the man commanding an empire that rivaled Paris's oldest houses. But like every empire, his was built on foundations of both gold and cracks. The glory was certain. The price had yet to reveal itself. The era of 1980 dawned as a time of excess, glitter, and decadence. For Yves Saint Laurent, it was the perfect stage and also the most dangerous. The YSL empire stood at the height of its commercial power, but the man behind the logo was collapsing like a sandcastle. The press had begun to speak not only of his collections, but of his endless nights. Yves, accompanied by his inseparable muses Betty, Catrou, and Lulu de la Falaise, plunged into a whirlwind of parties that began with champagne and ended with lines of cocaine across marble tables. The nightclubs of Paris and Marrakech became his dark temples. Drugs and alcohol, his only allies against insomnia and anxiety. Scandals multiplied. Leaked photographs showed a disheveled Yves, eyes lost, far removed from the impeccable genius of the runway. In 1971, he had already shocked the world by posing nude to promote his own men's fragrance, a revolutionary gesture that fused artistic provocation with daring marketing. But in the era of 1980, provocation ceased to be a weapon of intention and became a symptom of decline. Every runway show was still a triumph, but also a torment. Yves grew more erratic, vanishing for weeks at a time, retreating to his house in Marrakech. Unable to face the industry's relentless demands, the man who had once dressed women in power was now losing control over himself. Pierre Berger, his eternal companion, fought to hold the balance. In public, he defended Yves' genius. In private, he waged ferocious battles to pull him back from self-destruction. Their relationship became an emotional battlefield, shouts, reconciliations, silences heavy with resentment. They loved with intensity, but theirs was a love made of dynamite. The world began to ask, how much longer could the myth endure? Rumors of bankruptcy, of creative collapse, of forced retirement spread like shadows over the Maison. The industry, as cruel as ever, could already smell blood. Yves became a specter in life. His public appearances were rare, sometimes incoherent. Friends recalled how he could shift from childlike laughter to abyssal silence in a matter of seconds. Depression stalked him like a wolf, and tranquilizers barely kept him upright. Meanwhile, fashion was shifting. New names were rising. Jean-Paul Gaultier, Thierry Mugler, young designers who captured the energy of a generation hungry for excess and spectacle. The Emperor Saint Laurent seemed like a ghost of another age, trapped between his own myth and a reality he could no longer control. And yet, even in decline, Yves still had the power to astonish. His collections continued to set trends, as though genius, despite his frail body, still flowed through his veins. It was the Saint Laurent paradox. A man destroyed, who could still create sublime beauty. His downfall was not sudden, but slow, painful, public. Yves Saint Laurent had gone from the prodigy who succeeded Dior to the fallen idol whose private life had become spectacle. The headlines no longer spoke of Le Smoking or Pret-a-Porter, but of drugs, breakdowns, and unexplained disappearances. The myth hung in the balance. Could Yves save himself? Or was he destined to be devoured by the very shadows that had haunted him since childhood? Yves Saint Laurent's body began to reveal what his soul had been screaming in silence for years. Depression, medication, alcohol, drugs, every excess left a visible scar. His figure, once elegant and thin by choice, transformed into a fragile skeleton. His eyes, once timid but radiant, became dark wells reflecting exhaustion and pain. Doctors warned him. His health was in danger. But Yves refused to listen. Designing was his only way of breathing, and abandoning fashion meant accepting a living death. Every collection became a battle against time and against himself. Backstage at his shows was a silent war. Assistants running, Pierre Berger shouting at him to hold on, Yves trembling, clinging to a cigarette as if his entire existence depended on it. The toll was not only physical. Mentally, Yves was trapped in a labyrinth with no exit. Panic attacks froze him, sleepless nights multiplied, and psychiatric treatments only deepened his chemical dependency rather than delivering true recovery. Close friends recalled heartbreaking scenes, Yves crying without reason, Yves locked in his room for days, Yves begging for just a little silence inside his mind. His relationship with Pierre Berger became a minefield. Berger, pragmatic and relentless, fought to keep the empire afloat, while Yves drowned in fragility. There was love, yes, but also resentment. Berger pushed him to keep creating, convinced the Maison depended on his genius. Yves both hated him and needed him. That cycle of dependence and conflict became part of the tragedy itself. To the outside world, however, appearances held. The runway shows remained triumphs. The magazines continued to praise him. It was as if the industry chose to ignore the human cost behind the creations. But those who knew him understood the truth. Every new dress was a victory wrested from blood. In 1983, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York organized a grand retrospective of his work, the first time a living designer received such an honor. The world celebrated him as an immortal genius. Yves, meanwhile, felt empty. In the midst of applause, he could barely stand. That paradox, being worshipped as a god while collapsing as a man, was the essence of his tragedy. The consequences of his decline reached beyond his health. They distanced him from himself. Yves, who had been born to liberate women, who had made fashion a language of emancipation, could no longer find his own freedom. He became a prisoner of his name, his logo, the impossible expectations he himself had created. The price of glory was measured in raw flesh, insomnia, loneliness, constant fear. Yves Saint Laurent, the man who had revolutionized fashion, was paying for his genius with his very life. And still, he kept designing. Because deep down, the only thing that kept him alive was that razor-thin line between destruction and creation. The myth endured on a weakened body, a broken heart, a man who neither knew nor wanted to stop. The era of 1980 drew to a close, and with them, faded the illusion of invulnerability. Yves Saint Laurent stood on the brink of collapse, but he was not a man willing to vanish without a fight. Fashion, the monster that devoured him, was also his only salvation. Pierre Berger, tireless and pragmatic, devised a plan to rescue not only the designer but also the empire. He arranged stints in rehabilitation clinics, trips far from the noise of Paris, long retreats in Marrakech. In those arid, magical lands, Yves found fleeting moments of respite. The vibrant colors of the markets, the silence of lush gardens, the sensuality of Moroccan nights, among spices and mosaics. The genius seemed to be reborn, if only for brief instants. But every return to Paris meant re-entering the battlefield. The industry had no mercy. 2 Haute Couture collections each year, Pret-a-Porter lines to sustain, private clients to attend, the aura of the myth to uphold. Yves endured the cycle with the discipline of a condemned man. He designed feverishly, obsessed, as if each collection might be his last. By the twilight of 1980 and the dawn of 1990, his name once again reverberated with force. Certain collections were hailed as creative renaissances, flawless suits, dresses that recalled the sensuality of his best years, bold reinterpretations of his classics. The public wanted to believe Yves had returned. The retrospective at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris in 1991 was another milestone. Thousands came to pay homage to the man who had dressed entire generations. Yves appeared in public like an elegant ghost, fragile, yet still emanating that magnetic aura that set him apart. But the resurrection was never complete. Each triumph was fleeting, each ovation fading quickly into the silence of his apartment. Yves still relied on tranquilizers, still battled deep depressions. The man could never escape the wounded child he had once been in Oran. The era of 1990 became a decade of contrasts. On one hand, Saint Laurent remained an indisputable institution, an absolute reference in fashion. On the other, he became a symbol of decadence, a genius trapped in his own legend. His public appearances grew rarer, his health increasingly fragile. Pierre Berger did all he could to hold him up, but he too came to understand the battle was already lost. Yves could shine in fleeting bursts of brilliance, but the darkness always returned. In interviews, his tone carried resignation, as though he knew he had already given the world everything he could. And yet, there were moments of light. In every show, when models walked the runway draped in his vision of femininity, Yves smiled with that familiar mix of shyness and pride that had followed him since his earliest days at Dior. For a few minutes, it was as if he had defeated his demons. The attempts at resurrection never endured, but they left one truth behind. Even in his darkest hours, Yves Saint Laurent could create beauty. Even on the edge of the abyss, his genius remained intact. The myth survived. The man, however, was bleeding out slowly. Behind every runway, every applause, every magazine cover, Yves Saint Laurent lived a private life scarred by brutal contradictions. He loved to surround himself with people, yet deep down he inhabited an abyss of solitude. The parties, the muses, the lovers, everything was a desperate attempt to fill a void that could never be satisfied. His most enduring relationship, the one that defined his entire life, was with Pierre Berger. Partners, lovers, accomplices, and enemies all at once. Berger was the man who lifted him each time he fell, who held the empire together when Yves collapsed into darkness, but also the one who confronted him with merciless honesty. Their love was a permanent war. They screamed, they wounded, they reconciled as if drama itself were the fuel of their union. It was a relationship made of cement and dynamite. Beyond Berger, Yves sought refuge in his muses. Betty Couture was his androgynous shadow, his alter ego in the endless Parisian nights. Together they wandered through clubs, vanished into smoke and music, sharing silences that spoke louder than 1,000 words. Loulou de la Falaise, on the other hand, was the luminous spark, creative, bohemian, capable of drawing a smile from him, even in his darkest hours. Between them, and others within his intimate circle, Yves found mirrors of his own complexity. But despite being surrounded by people, solitude haunted him like a ghost. At dawn, after nights filled with lights and laughter, he would return to his apartment alone, left with his cigarettes and memories. The silence was unbearable. There, in those longest nights, he confronted his demons. Insecurity, the fear of being forgotten, the certainty that success would never be enough to soothe his inner pain. Lovers drifted by like shadows. Some intense, others fleeting, none could fill the void. Yves searched in every relationship for salvation, but it never came. His fragile heart made him dependent, yet also incapable of sustaining lasting love. Marrakech became his refuge. In his majestic villa, surrounded by exotic gardens, Yves found temporary relief. The city gave him anonymity, vibrant colors, warm nights. In Morocco, far from the flashes of Paris, he could walk barefoot, gaze at the starry skies, lose himself in the markets like an ordinary man. And yet, even there, the weight of his legend reached him. The myth never allowed him to rest entirely. In those endless nights, Yves became a divided man, the brilliant creator who liberated women, and the broken human being who longed desperately for a fragment of peace. Between the crowds and the silence, between applause and private tears, his life was a perpetual pendulum. His solitude was so profound that it seeped into his work. Every garment, every collection carried that melancholy. Yves' dresses were not just clothes, they were confessions of a fragile soul, silent cries woven into silk and velvet. The longest nights of Yves Saint Laurent did not unfold in Parisian clubs or in Marrakech's glittering soirée. They happened in the intimacy of silence, when the music faded, when the lights went out, and only he remained facing the mirror, a cigarette in hand, haunted by a single unanswered question: who am I, truly, behind the myth? To speak of Yves Saint Laurent is to speak of a man who turned fashion into a cultural weapon. His legacy cannot be measured only in collections, but in revolutions. What he did was not simply dress bodies, it was change minds. With Le Smoking, Yves did not design a suit, he wrote a manifesto. He placed women in trousers at a time when they were still denied entry to restaurants and clubs if they were not in skirts. He gave them a symbol of power, a uniform of seduction and authority. Each time a woman slipped into that tuxedo, she was claiming her place in a world ruled by men. With Rive Gauche prêt-à-porter, he shook the foundations of haute couture. Until then, fashion was the privilege of millionaires and aristocrats. Yves democratized it. He brought elegance to the streets, gave young students the chance to dress like modern queens. Fashion stopped being an exclusive club and became a universal language. His inspirations shattered borders. He took Mondrian's colors and turned them into geometric dresses. He drew from Russian folklore, from Moroccan Africa, from Oriental opulence. The runway of Yves Saint Laurent was a world map, a place where cultures blended without asking permission. He was among the first to put black models on his catwalks, challenging racial prejudice in an industry still trapped in conservatism. Each collection was a dialogue with art, politics, and society. Yves understood that fashion was not superficiality, but a mirror of the times. In his dresses lived feminism, in his sheer fabrics, sexual freedom, in his tunics, multiculturalism. He was a creator, yes, but also a chronicler of his age. Designers who came after him all drank from his legacy. Giorgio Armani carried forward the banner of sobriety. Jean-Paul Gaultier inherited irreverence. Alexander McQueen embraced darkness. Yet all of them, in one way or another, walked the path Yves had first opened. Beyond the industry, his influence reached deep into society's heart. Women who could never afford an original YSL still drew inspiration from his aesthetic, from the idea that they could dress with strength, with sensuality, with freedom. Yves Saint Laurent did not only change the way we dress, he changed the way we exist. In 2002, when he announced his retirement, the world finally grasped the magnitude of his legacy. At his last Haute Couture show, applause mingled with tears. Models from across generations walked the runway, as if celebrating both a funeral and a rebirth. The genius was leaving the stage, but his work was already immortal. The legacy of Yves Saint Laurent endures because his revolution never ended. Every woman who puts on a suit, every young person who dares to mix the classic with the modern, every designer who breaks a rule carries a piece of Saint Laurent beneath their skin. He himself summed it up in one sentence: fashion fades, style is eternal. And his style, the style of liberation, of provocation, of transformation, remains alive long after his final breath. When Yves Saint Laurent announced his retirement in 2002, the fashion world shuddered. It was not simply the farewell of a designer, it was the end of an era. For more than 4 decades, Yves had dictated the rules of dress, and at the same time, broken them with ease. Now, the man who had turned fashion into revolution stepped away from the runway, tired, fragile, a shadow of the figure who once defined a century. The press covered it as if a head of state were abdicating. Headlines spoke of the king's farewell, the retreat of the genius, the last emperor of haute couture. His final show at the Centre Pompidou featured more than 300 models, a procession through his life, a visual testament to his greatness. The audience wept, critics rose to their feet, and Yves, serious, reserved, watched, as though his entire life were passing before his eyes. After his retirement, the world's gaze upon him became more complex. The frantic rhythm of collections that once masked his fragility was gone. What remained was the man stripped of his creative routine, left alone with his ghosts. The press wrote of his failing health, of his solitude, of his continued dependence on medical treatments. And yet, the myth grew. Exhibitions, documentaries, museum retrospectives. The name Yves Saint Laurent ceased to be just a brand, it became cultural heritage. His house, the Maison YSL, continued under other designers, but always in dialogue with the master's spirit. Every time the YSL logo appeared, the world remembered the young man who, at 21, took the reins of Dior. The visionary who invented luxury pret-a-porter. The rebel who freed women with a tuxedo. The public began to speak of him in almost mythical terms. His scandals, his nights of excess, his battles with depression, those became the human shadows of a fallen god. What remained, unshaken, was the work. Yves Saint Laurent had achieved what few ever do, to transcend fashion and become an eternal symbol. The myth crystallized with his death in 2008. When Pierre Berger announced the news, Paris fell into a heavy silence. From politicians to artists, from models to rival designers, the world united to pay tribute. His funeral was nearly an act of state, a recognition that with needle and thread, he had shaped the cultural destiny of the 20th century. Today, the memory of Yves Saint Laurent oscillates between two images. On one side, the genius who revolutionized fashion, democratized elegance, and turned clothing into a political and artistic manifesto. On the other, the broken man, the fragile boy from Oran who never fully healed his wounds. Both images coexist within the myth, and perhaps that duality is precisely what makes him eternal, because at the core, Yves Saint Laurent embodies a universal truth. Genius never comes without a price, and in his case, that price was his very life. Le juin 2008, Paris awoke to a piece of news that froze the heart of the fashion world. Yves Saint Laurent was dead. He was 71. The city that had once watched him conquer glory now mourned him as a fallen hero. Outside his maison on Avenue Marceau, flowers and letters piled up like an improvised altar. The fragile boy from Oran, the apprentice of Dior, the creator of silent revolutions, had taken his final breath. His funeral was solemn, laden with symbolism. Personalities from every corner of the planet gathered at the Church of Saint Rocher. Models who had once been his muses, designers who grew under his shadow, politicians, artists, all united by the same certainty. With Yves Saint Laurent, not only a man had died, but an entire chapter of 20th century cultural history. Pierre Berger, his eternal companion, spoke words that would remain forever etched in memory. "You taught me beauty, but you also taught me pain. Today, the whole world recognizes what I always knew, that you were a genius." It was both an intimate and a public farewell, the closing of a relationship woven from love and storm, complicity and tragedy. Yves's legacy did not end with his death. His designs live on, in museums, on runways, and in the streets where women and men still dress with the freedom he helped to conquer. Every time someone dares to break a dress code, every time fashion intertwines with art and politics, the shadow of Saint Laurent walks among us once more. His life was an eternal parade between light and darkness. He was the man who dressed women with power, who democratized elegance, who transformed the act of dressing into a cry for freedom. But he was also the man who paid for every applause with solitude, for every triumph with tears, for every collection with a new wound. In the end, Yves Saint Laurent left us with a devastating and beautiful truth. Fashion fades, but style remains. And his style, woven of rebellion, fragility, and genius, will remain forever. He was not just a designer. He was a revolutionary, a poet of fabric, a martyr of his own brilliance. And today, more than ever, his name resounds as what it has always been, eternal.